Welcome to my YouTube channel. Hit the like button, share your thoughts, subscribe and tap the bell icon. The courtroom felt too quiet. Eyes shifted toward the man standing near the defense table. His coat was torn. Dirt covered his sleeves. His shoes had no laces. His hair was unkempt, a mess of gray and brown. He didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He just stood there, like he had nothing left to lose. People in the gallery leaned forward. No one said a word. Even the reporters stayed still. The tension was thick. The air felt heavy. The judge glanced at the man and then back down at the papers in front of him. His eyes narrowed. The man hadn't been brought in for a simple charge. He wasn't facing a minor offense. No, this was bigger than anyone realized. No one knew it yet, but this trial was about to take a turn no one expected. The defense attorney sat stiffly, barely moving. His eyes darted from the defendant to the judge and then back again. He'd been handling cases like this for years, but something in the air today felt different. The prosecutor didn't even glance at the defendant. She stared straight ahead, tapping her pen against the desk. "State your full name," the court clerk said, breaking the silence. Her voice echoed in the stillness. The man raised his head slowly. His voice was low, but it carried through the room, sharp enough to cut through the tension. "David Allen Bishop." The judge froze. You could feel the silence snap in the air like a rubber band. The judge's pen slipped from his hand. It hit the desk with a click. A long pause followed. Then he stood up. Slowly, as if every movement carried the weight of something enormous. One of the jurors whispered, "Did he say Bishop?" Another juror nodded, her face pale. She looked around, hoping to see someone else's reaction, but no one else seemed to understand what was happening. The judge didn't speak. He just stared at the man in front of him. His hands gripped the edge of the bench. Hard. David didn't look away. He didn't blink. Not once. His eyes were focused, unwavering. A man who had seen too much. A man who had walked through hell and back, but was still standing. And for the first time in this courtroom, everyone was beginning to wonder why. The prosecutor sat up straight. She leaned over to her assistant and whispered something, but her voice couldn't be heard. Her eyes were wide, locked onto the defendant. Something was wrong. It was as if the entire courtroom had shifted under their feet. Something in the air felt colder. A police officer near the door took a step forward. He looked confused. He leaned toward the prosecutor and asked something in a low voice. She didn't respond at first, just stared back at David, as if trying to figure out what was so familiar about him. Something was pulling at her memory, but she couldn't place it. The judge's hands trembled as he placed them on the desk. He took a deep breath. His gaze was still fixed on David. The courtroom was still, suffocatingly so. Everyone was waiting. Everyone was feeling the pressure building. But no one knew why. Finally, the judge broke the silence. His voice was low, almost like a whisper. "We'll take a 10-minute recess." The words hit like a wave, crashing through the tension. The room shifted slightly, like the weight had been lifted, if only for a moment. No one moved. "I said, court is in recess." The judge's voice grew more forceful, like he was trying to wrestle control over a situation that had quickly spiraled out of his grasp. He turned and left the bench without another word, walking quickly toward the back doors. His footsteps echoed in the quiet, and the sound seemed to stretch on forever. A sense of unease washed over the room as people began to stand. But even then, there was no relief. No one knew what had just happened. What was that name? Why had the judge reacted the way he did? The room emptied out slowly. A few murmurs started as the crowd filed out into the hallway, but no one spoke directly about what had happened. There was an unspoken understanding that something strange had just occurred. Something they couldn't explain. Outside the courtroom, the air felt different. A low hum of nervous energy ran through the building. Reporters gathered, speaking in hushed voices, exchanging glances, trying to make sense of what had just happened. They pulled out their phones, their fingers scrolling quickly, trying to figure out if there was something they missed, some hidden connection. David stood by the exit, waiting. No handcuffs. No chains. He wasn't being escorted by guards. No one touched him. He stood alone, his posture unshaken. For a man who had been accused of a crime that could have left him in prison for years, he seemed remarkably calm. He had already accepted whatever fate awaited him. But there was something about him, something that made everyone uneasy. In the judge's chambers, the door slammed shut. The air inside felt even heavier. The judge paced back and forth, his movements quick, almost erratic. He hadn't felt this unsettled in years. He was a man who had seen everything, the good, the bad, the ugly, but this? This was different. He walked over to his desk and picked up the phone. He dialed a number, his fingers trembling just slightly. "I need everything you have on the defendant. Now." The voice on the other end responded quickly. "What's going on, Judge? We're not supposed to." "I don't care about the protocols," he snapped, his voice low but laced with panic. "Just get me the file. And don't make me wait." The phone call ended abruptly. The judge leaned over the desk, his elbows on the surface. His mind was racing. He couldn't stop thinking about that name, David Allen Bishop. His eyes flicked back to the sealed file sitting on the corner of the desk, the file that had been delivered earlier, just before the trial began. It was marked, confidential. The name on the front was almost mocking in its simplicity. David Allen Bishop. How could he be here? How could he be the same person? The judge's mind was spinning. He had to know more. He had to understand why everything felt wrong. Why the name had triggered something so deeply buried in him. The minutes dragged on. Down the hall, the jurors stood in small clusters, talking in low voices, but no one spoke of the defendant yet. The name had unsettled them too. They couldn't help it. But what were they supposed to do? What could they possibly say? "Did you hear that?" one of the jurors whispered. "Bishop? Wasn't he?" "Shoo!" another juror quickly interrupted, glancing nervously toward the judge's chambers. "You'll get us in trouble. Don't say anything." Meanwhile, outside the building, David took slow, deliberate steps, making his way toward the street. The rain began to fall. It wasn't a light drizzle, it was a heavy downpour that hit the pavement with force. People scrambled for cover. But David? He walked through it like it was nothing. The water soaked his clothes, but he didn't seem to care. He didn't even bother to shield himself from the downpour. He just kept walking. The reporters followed. Cameras flashed. Questions were thrown at him from all sides, but David didn't respond. Not one word. He didn't look back, didn't even acknowledge them. One reporter, a young woman with dark hair, called out to him. "David, wait." David didn't stop. He didn't even pause. He just turned the corner and disappeared into the alleyway. The woman pushed through the crowd, but by the time she reached the corner, he was gone. No sign of him. Just the empty street. It was as if he had vanished. And then, in the distant silence, one question lingered: who was David Allen Bishop? The only thing anyone knew for certain was that no one in that courtroom would ever be the same again. David walked through the rain without slowing his pace. The streetlights flickered above him, casting long shadows against the wet pavement. It was almost as if the world had forgotten about him. People hurried past, their heads bent against the downpour, too focused on their own lives to notice the man who had just caused a stir in the courtroom. But David knew something that they didn't. He always had. His heart raced. But his face? His face was calm. The same calm that had settled over him when he'd stepped into the courtroom. He was used to this, used to the confusion, the questions, the waiting. What was to come next didn't matter. He had walked through enough storms in his life to know that this was just one more. Yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was different this time. That name, David Allen Bishop. It had triggered something deep within the judge. Something dark, something buried. David didn't know what that meant yet, but he knew it would change everything. The rain soaked through his jacket as he walked deeper into the alley. He turned a corner, disappearing from the eyes of the world. Inside his head, the pieces of the puzzle were slowly coming together. He didn't know how long it would take to finish, but he knew it would be worth the wait. Back at the courthouse, chaos had begun to unravel. The judge was still in his chambers, staring at the file with a mix of disbelief and growing unease. He had ordered that the file be brought to him quickly, but it hadn't arrived yet. His fingers drummed anxiously on the desk as he waited. His thoughts swirled, his mind racing with 100 questions. David Allen Bishop. That name. It was the key to something, and the judge couldn't ignore it. He had to know what it meant. He couldn't just pretend this was another ordinary case. It wasn't. Inside the courtroom, the prosecutor, who had been so confident just hours before, was now pacing the floor. She was trying to make sense of what had happened, but every time she tried to connect the dots, they seemed to slip away. The name didn't fit. It didn't belong with the homeless man who had been arrested for trespassing. How could it? She turned to her assistant. Get me everything you can on David Allen Bishop. I want it now. This is no longer just about trespassing. The assistant nodded, his face pale. Understood. I'll make the calls. The prosecutor walked toward the gallery, where reporters had gathered, asking questions about the case. They were clamoring for answers, but none of them had any. No one knew who David Allen Bishop really was. The camera crews followed her as she passed, her heels clicking on the marble floor. Any word on what's going on with the judge? One of the reporters asked. She shook her head. We're waiting for answers ourselves. Back outside, David walked through the empty streets. The world was quiet, the hum of the city drowned out by the sound of the rain. But in his mind, the wheels were turning. He had been here before. He knew how to survive. He had survived the streets, the cold, the hunger. He had survived everything life had thrown at him. And now, it seemed, he was about to survive something much bigger than he had ever imagined. David wasn't worried. He had nothing left to lose. He had given everything up a long time ago. His family, his job, his friends, all gone. It was just him now, and he was okay with that. He had learned to be okay with being alone. But there was something else inside of him now. A fire. A purpose. A reason to keep going. And the trial was just the beginning. He paused at the corner, his eyes scanning the street. He had been followed. He could feel it. He didn't need to turn around to know that someone was behind him. He knew how to spot a tail. David kept walking, his pace steady, his mind focused. He turned down another alley, slipping through the shadows. His footsteps were quiet, almost too quiet. He knew the city like the back of his hand. He had been here long enough to understand the rhythm of it. He knew the alleys, the hidden paths, the places where he could disappear. The footsteps behind him slowed. They stopped. Then, he heard a voice. David. It was soft, almost hesitant. But David didn't need to turn around. He already knew who it was. He stopped in his tracks and turned around slowly. The woman was standing there, drenched from head to toe, her eyes wide with something that was hard to place. Was it fear? Curiosity? It was hard to say. "I told you to wait back there," David said, his voice calm. The woman took a step forward. "I couldn't just leave." "You're not who you say you are you?" David's expression didn't change. He studied her for a moment, his gaze lingering on her wet clothes and the fear in her eyes. He could see that she was struggling to understand. To piece together what had just happened in the courtroom. "No," he replied, his voice steady. "I'm not." She blinked, the realization hitting her. "Who are you, really?" David took a deep breath. "I'm someone who's been lost for a long time. But I'm finding my way back." He turned to walk away, but the woman stepped forward again, her hand reaching out. "You can't just walk away from this," she said, her voice trembling. "You can't just disappear." David paused, glancing over his shoulder. "I'm not disappearing. I'm just moving forward." "Forward?" She laughed bitterly. "You're a homeless man, facing charges. What future do you have?" David didn't answer. He just started walking again. And this time, she didn't follow. Not at first. As he walked through the rain, his mind shifted. The pieces of the puzzle that had started to fit together were now moving faster. Someone in that courtroom had recognized his name. That was the key. Someone knew him. But why? His phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking his thoughts. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen. It was a text message from an unknown number. "Meet me. You're not alone in this." David didn't reply. He didn't need to. He had learned long ago not to trust strangers. But there was something about this message, something that gnawed at him. He continued to walk, heading toward the edge of the city. He needed to think. Needed to figure out his next move. Whoever had sent that message knew something. And they were waiting. The rain hadn't let up. If anything, it was getting worse. But David didn't care. The cold didn't bother him. It never had. He had learned to survive with nothing. But this? This was something different. As he walked, his thoughts kept circling back to the name. David Allen Bishop. Why did it matter? Why had the judge reacted that way? The message on his phone buzzed again. Another text. "You're not just a homeless man. You never were." David stopped in his tracks. His heart thudded in his chest. Someone knew. Someone knew the truth. David didn't know how much time had passed when he arrived at the address listed in the text. The city felt different now. It was as if the shadows were closer, the streets darker, and the hum of life quieter. He could feel the weight of something about to happen, but what? It was impossible to say. The text had only given him an address, and with the rain still coming down in sheets, the place looked like just another rundown building, a hollow shell in a city that had forgotten its past. The door was a heavy iron thing, the kind that looked like it had seen more than its fair share of trouble. The kind of door no one would dare knock on unless they had no choice. David hesitated, staring at the worn edges, his fingers tracing the cold surface. His heart beat a little faster. The message kept playing over and over in his mind, "You're not just a homeless man. You never were." Who was sending him these texts? Why? And more importantly, what truth were they speaking about? Was he really just a broken man in a tattered jacket, trying to survive the streets? Or was there something more to his story? The pieces were scattered, and David wasn't sure if he was the one who needed to put them together. Finally, with a sigh that felt more like a resignation, he pushed the door open. The inside of the building was darker than the street outside. The air was thick with the smell of stale cigarettes and old wood. It looked abandoned, like no one had cared for it in years. But there was something else, something that David couldn't quite place. Something, alive. A figure stood at the far end of the room, half hidden in the shadows. The man's silhouette was tall, almost imposing. David's instincts told him to be cautious, but his curiosity pushed him forward. "Are you the one who sent me those messages?" David's voice was rough, the words scraped out of him like they were a struggle to speak. But he forced them out. He needed answers. The man didn't move. He didn't say anything at first. Instead, he took a slow step forward, his face coming into the dim light. And David's breath caught in his throat. He had seen this man before. It took him a moment to place it, but then it hit him like a punch in the gut. The man standing before him was a younger version of someone he had not thought about in years, someone whose face had been buried in the back of his mind. It was his father. David stood frozen, his mind a whirlwind. His father was supposed to be dead. That was the story, wasn't it? He had died in a car accident when David was just a boy. But this man was alive, standing before him in the shadows of a crumbling building. "Dad?" David whispered, not fully believing it, not trusting his own eyes. The man's lips twitched, but he didn't answer. He stepped into the light fully, his eyes locked onto David's with an intensity that sent chills down David's spine. "I know this is a shock," the man said, his voice a low rasp that David hadn't heard in years. "But there's no time for explanations, not yet. There are things you don't know, things that have been hidden from you for a long time. And it's time for you to know the truth." David's mind reeled. Truth? What truth? What was he talking about? His heart thudded painfully in his chest as he struggled to process what he was hearing. Could this really be his father? How was it possible? I don't understand. How are you here?" David's words came out jagged, like shards of glass. The man, his father, took a deep breath, his hands rubbing together in a nervous gesture that was so human, so real, that it made David feel like he had been pulled into a nightmare. "You were never meant to be on the streets," his father said, stepping forward again. "You were never supposed to end up like this. But we didn't have a choice. It was the only way to keep you safe." David's head spun. "Safe? What are you talking about? You died. I saw it. I saw the car wreck. I saw your name in the papers." His father's eyes hardened, a flicker of anger flashing across his features. "It was a lie. They made sure it looked like I died. It was the only way to protect you." David stepped back, the shock settling in like a weight on his chest. The pieces of the puzzle were not just scattered now, they were shifting, blending together into a picture he couldn't yet recognize. His father hadn't died. He had faked his death. But why? And why hadn't David known any of this? "Why didn't you come for me?" David's voice cracked as he asked the question that had haunted him for years. "Why did you leave me? I had to survive on my own, and you just—" "I know, son. I know." His father's voice softened, and for a brief moment, there was an ache of sadness in his eyes. "I never wanted you to go through that. But I had no choice. You have to understand, there were people who would have come after you if they knew you were alive. If they knew you were my son. They still might." David was shaking his head now, trying to make sense of everything. "Who would want to hurt me? What is all of this? Why the secrecy?" His father stepped closer, his hands clasped tightly in front of him, as if he were preparing for something monumental. "There's something you don't know, David. You're not just anyone. Your bloodline. It's connected to something bigger. Your mother and I. We were involved in something dangerous. Something that's been hidden for years." David's stomach twisted as the words sank in. "What kind of dangerous thing? What are you talking about?" His father's face grew even more serious. I can't say much right now. It's too risky. But trust me, you've been marked. People know who you are. They've known for years, and they've been watching. David stepped back, his mind racing. No. No, you can't be serious. Why didn't you warn me about this? Why didn't you? Before David could finish his sentence, the door behind them slammed open with a deafening crash. Several men, dressed in black and carrying weapons, stormed into the room. David's heart skipped a beat, and instinctively, he grabbed his father's arm, pulling him away. But it was too late. The men were already closing in, their eyes scanning the room with cold precision. They weren't here for a friendly chat. They were here to take something. David's father turned to him, his face full of urgency. Run, David. Now. I'll hold them off. But David couldn't move. Not this time. Not when everything was falling apart. The men advanced, their weapons aimed directly at them. Do as he says, son, his father urged again, his voice cracking with a mix of fear and resolve. David looked into his father's eyes, seeing something there that he hadn't seen in years. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about something deeper, something more dangerous than David had ever imagined. And just as the first gunshot rang out, David knew that nothing at all, would ever be the same again. The sound of the gunshot reverberated through the room, piercing the air like a blade. David's heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, everything went still. He didn't know if the bullet had struck or if it was just a warning shot. But he didn't have the luxury of time to figure it out. His father's voice, desperate and commanding, cut through the silence. Run, David. Go. Without thinking, David pulled away from his father's grasp, his legs moving on instinct. He didn't know where to go, didn't know what to do, but his mind screamed at him to move. To get out of there. The room around him seemed to close in. The men in black were advancing quickly, their boots echoing on the old wooden floor. Their eyes locked onto David, and he felt the weight of their gaze like a trap closing around him. David dashed for the door, but his legs were shaking, his body moving on adrenaline alone. The fear that had once lived deep inside him, the fear he had buried for so long, came rushing back to the surface. He had been running his whole life, running from his past, running from the streets, running from the truth. But now, he was running from something much worse. The men were faster, and within moments, one of them was right behind him. A hand reached out and grabbed David by the collar, yanking him backward with a force that made his chest slam against the hard floor. Pain shot through his body as he hit the ground, his breath knocked out of him. He tried to scramble to his feet, but the man was on top of him now, pinning him down. David's father was still fighting, his voice shouting in defiance, but it was clear he was outnumbered. The others were closing in, guns raised, their cold eyes trained on him. David could barely breathe. His mind spun in a blur of confusion, adrenaline, and fear. This wasn't supposed to be his life. He wasn't supposed to be here, struggling for his life in the shadows of a forgotten building, with his father's secrets threatening to destroy everything. Stop. David's voice came out in a rasp, raw and desperate. He twisted under the man holding him, his hands scrabbling for anything to push him off. You don't understand. You don't know who I am. But the man only laughed, a cruel, mocking sound. He tightened his grip on David's throat, cutting off his words. You think we don't know who you are? The man's voice was cold. You're more than just a homeless man, aren't you? You're the key. You always have been. David's mind raced. The key? What was he talking about? What was the truth his father had been hinting at? Was this what it was all about? Was he really important enough to be hunted down like this? Suddenly, there was a loud crash. David's father had thrown something, probably a chair, at one of the men. The distraction was just enough. The man holding David let out a shout as he turned to face the chaos. In that moment, David acted on instinct. He kicked hard, using every ounce of strength he had left. His foot connected with the man's ribs, sending him stumbling backward. David scrambled to his feet, barely able to keep his balance. He didn't think about what he was doing. He didn't think about the consequences. He just ran. He ran as fast as he could, his body moving without any clear direction. The world around him was a blur of rain and shadows. His father's voice echoed in his mind, urging him to escape, to survive. But was this really survival? Was running away the answer? His legs burned with effort, but he couldn't stop. He couldn't stop running. The men chased him through the winding alleyways, their footsteps relentless. David could hear them gaining on him. His heart pounded in his chest, his breath ragged as he stumbled over uneven pavement. He had to get away. He had to find a way out of this nightmare. A sharp pain suddenly shot through his side. His breath caught in his throat as his body collapsed to the ground. His mind screamed at him to keep moving, but his body refused to listen. He rolled onto his back, panting, his vision blurred. They were getting closer. He could hear them. He could feel them. But then, something changed. A loud screech filled the air, followed by the roar of an engine. David barely had time to react before a black SUV screeched to a halt in front of him, blocking the path of the men chasing him. The door flew open, and a figure stepped out. It was his father. David couldn't believe his eyes. How had he gotten here so fast? How had he found him? His father's eyes were filled with determination, but there was something else there too, something that told David this wasn't just about survival anymore. This was bigger than that. "Get in," his father shouted. David didn't hesitate. He ran for the car, his legs heavy with exhaustion but fueled by sheer panic. He dove into the passenger seat, slamming the door behind him. His father immediately slammed the gas pedal to the floor, and the SUV roared to life, speeding away from the men who had been chasing them. David glanced out the back window, watching as the figures of the men grew smaller in the distance. His heart pounded, but for the first time since this nightmare began, he felt a sliver of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he was going to get out of this alive. But then, his father's voice broke through the silence. "It's not over," he said grimly, his eyes focused on the road ahead. "They'll keep coming. They won't stop." David looked at his father, his mind racing with questions, but one burned brighter than the others. Why? Why are they after me? What do they want from me? His father's grip tightened on the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a deep breath, as if gathering his thoughts. "They want what's in your blood, David," he said softly. "You're part of something, something ancient. Something powerful. And they've been hunting you for years, waiting for the moment when they could finally take you." David's head spun. This couldn't be real. It couldn't. But his father's expression was so serious, so filled with regret, that David couldn't deny the weight of his words. "They're not just after you because of your name," his father continued. "They want you because of who you are. And they'll stop at nothing to get you." David swallowed hard. The weight of the truth settled on him like a lead anchor. His life had never been about surviving on the streets. It had never been about getting by day to day. It had always been about something much bigger. Something that David had never known. "Are you saying I'm special?" David's voice was barely a whisper. His father's eyes flicked to him for a moment, then back to the road. "You could say that. But it's not a gift, David. It's a curse." The SUV sped through the rain-soaked streets, the world outside a blur. David's mind was spinning, trying to process everything his father had just revealed. He had never wanted to be special. He had never asked for any of this. But now, as he sat in the passenger seat of that car, running from men who wanted to capture him for reasons he couldn't even understand, he realized that his life was never going to be the same again. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about fighting to stay alive. And as they sped away from the chaos behind them, David knew that the real battle was just beginning.